So I'm very honored to be joined here on stage by two of the artists from the exhibition, Halima Cassel and Alison Britton. And they are going to talk us through some of the specifics of their own work in the show, which I hope you've all now seen, and also a few other questions that I have in store for them. So maybe if I could start with you, Alison. You actually have 3 works in the exhibition that come from different decades. Which was quite an intentional choice on our part and one that we discussed with you as we were preparing the exhibition. I wonder if you could first tell me a little bit about each of them and how they sort of fit into a career arc, and then, if this isn't too much to ask all at once, also how you feel seeing them together in the context of the exhibition.
Well, the first piece is the 1987 Leaning Blue and White pot, which comes from a sort of jagged, slabby phase of my work. Where I wasn't sort of moderating the form with coiling by that stage. The second piece is the green, double green pot, which is a different piece from the one that was loaned by an American collector to the Yale exhibition. And that's called, that was 1995. And that's sort of painting it as an entity rather than assembling it from parts of a slab which have been previously painted. So it's more unified on some level, but at the same time it's got this kind of drastic schism of a curvaceous chamber and an angular one. I think I'm always really wanting for some kind of contrast going on, or for most of my career I've wanted to kind of bang things together that don't necessarily belong. Various commentators have talked about that being a sort of urban disposition. Which may well be true. Then the final piece is much later, it's 2012, and that was from a fairly radical decision to use red clay again, which started for me when I had a very short residency in Shigaraki, and I chose to do something I hadn't done for ages. I hadn't used red clay since I was 25 or something. And because I love the colour of the clay, I couldn't bring myself to glaze all over it. So they're, for the first time in my life, not holding water as vessels. I've only poured glaze over the same areas as I've poured the slip. And pouring, the sort of danger of pouring on an irregular shape was the attraction for me. So they represent very different things for me.
And would you say that there's a kind of progression that you can see in that lineup of 3 moments, or are there too many variables for you to see it as a kind of linear pathway?
I think from my perspective, I used to think it was a progression, and now I've started to enjoy, now there have been a lot of decades of work, I've enjoyed seeing different periods put together in as many contexts as I'm allowed to do that. And I really like some of the work again that I made in the, say, 80s and so on. I couldn't do it anymore, but I sort of respect it more than I did when I'd just done it.
That implies that you went through a period of not liking it so much?
I think I've always wanted to not make things twice. So in always moving on, you sometimes go into a sort of rather blank corner.
I guess one last question just about the 3 pots before we move on to more general issues. That last piece, Outpour, which is in the V&A collection, one of many pieces that have been generously lent by the V&A, by the way, I should add. You mentioned that there's a kind of risk involved in that process of putting the slip onto the surface of the vessel. And I wonder if you could just talk through that a little bit more for those who haven't seen you actually do it. What's exactly involved there and how difficult is it?
Unlike most of my work, I can't do it on my own. I have a willing ex-student who might sort of tilt something or move it in order for the pouring to negotiate with the shape.
Because the distance is so great that you can't hold it and pour?
Well, it depends on the kind of form. In fact, in that upright one, I could have done that by myself. But if they're much lumpier and more awkward shapes, then there's a lot of leaning that goes on and sort of supporting. I've missed half your question. What was the other?
Well, I guess what I'm driving at, that just to describe it, I think is important, but there's something about the freedom and the risk that's involved.
And it's sort of all or nothing. You do it once and you can't go back. You can't touch it up. It's
like watercolor.
Yeah, you get what you've got and carry on.
Right. Okay. Halima, can we talk a little bit about Virtues of Unity? it would be great to hear you talk about that work. Of course, I know you're asked about it often, but could you also give the audience a little bit of a sense of the broader context of your work? And this isn't all you do, clearly. So could you describe a little bit about your work in general and then how that work fits in?
Okay, clay is my first love. I started with clay, and over the last 10 years, the work is expanded in other materials such as stone, chainsaw work, and glass casting. But I always come back to the clay. I probably do, I would say 50 and 50 of clay and other materials. Virtues of Unity was an installation which was, the idea was created from a situation that I was in 2009 when I decided to visit my home, my birth country, Pakistan. And growing up in the north of England in Manchester, I was always perceived as a foreigner or a second generation immigrant, and so I thought this trip residency at the universities in Pakistan that I would be getting a homecoming. And I was quite surprised when I was introduced in all the institutions as a foreigner from England. And it kind of, I suppose it kind of, you know, for years of wanting to revisit Pakistan. You know, I was a baby when I came to England, and I think all those kind of sense of belonging was kind of shattered, and I think that posed a lot of questions in my mind. And so the whole idea of Virtues of Unity was to do with identity and belonging, and can we really say where we come from? So.
Right. And I realize that many people will understand this well, but could you describe a little bit about the process of gathering the clays and how each of the vessels corresponds to a specific geographic location?
The idea behind installation is that I will have clay from the earth from every country where possible around the world eventually. And some clays are dug out very crudely from the ground and used as they come. Others have been refined and some have been processed depending where they've come from, and each one has a different quality. Some are very difficult to use. That determines the design that I carve into it. If I'm very confident with the clay, then obviously it will be a more complex design. If it's like the Pakistani clay and the Welsh clay today are the most difficult clays that I have used, and I've had to reconstitute them and remake them, and sometimes with some of the clays I have to add grog into it or fibres into it to make it sustainable to make a piece out of. I mean, I've had clay from dug out from Cuba where it's had donkey hairs and plastic, you know, pulling out bits of plastic out of it, and it's very exciting working with the different clays because I never know what the result's going to be. Each piece is an experimental piece, and sometimes I have enough clay to remake a piece and other times I don't. So
Halima, how do you go about actually securing the clay? Because it's not that you're necessarily going yourself to that location and digging it out of the ground with a shovel, although you have done some of that. So how do you locate and source the clays?
So far, I mean, it's other people going to other countries, like the clay from Cuba. There's someone I knew who was going for a belly dancing course, and she came back with the Cuban clay, which she carried as hand luggage on her hip. So it was kind of a U-shape when she gave it me. Other clays have been sent or given kindly by people, like Felicity brought back some clay, what she allowed me to use from China, and so people, Joanna Bird went to Jordan. Oh, sorry. Joanna Bird went to Jordan and bought me some clay back from a pottery there. I've got a friend going to Mexico to visit some friends, and they're sending me some clay back from Mexico. So hopefully the installation will grow with people traveling and bringing back clay for me.
So it's a kind of expanded network of social relationships that you're mapping as well.
Yes, and people who are interested in contributing to the project.
Another feature of the work is that each of the objects has its own name, a kind of abstract noun, like creativity, unity is one of them, virtue. I think the ideas of calling each one a virtue, I think what brings us together as
species, as as mankind, is the virtues that we all live by, regardless of our religion, our status, our background, and the virtues, very simple virtues. And so I've been collecting various virtues or different virtues in different countries and writing the names down, and hopefully I'll have enough names to cover all the countries.
So is there a kind of correspondence between the virtue that you're using as a title for that work and something that's believed to be important in that culture?
There have been in some of the pieces, but not on all.
Okay.
As the installation grows, obviously the virtues, there'll be less to choose from, and but yeah, I mean, the Israeli one was called Hope, and the Pakistani one was called Charity, because in Pakistan they have a big thing about giving a percentage of the wage to charity, to disadvantaged, so it's a nice name to give it. So
Right. Last question about that particular work. It strikes me as an extremely optimistic work, which is one reason that we ended the exhibition. And I wonder about your own experience of having put it together. Is the process of gathering those clays from so many people and then manifesting them as these physical objects, has that in fact been a uniformly positive, optimistic, hopeful process? Has it been one of setbacks and eventual success? What's it been like over these many years?
It's a very slow process. I'm hoping, as the installation is shown a lot more, the quicker I'll be able to get hold of more clays. But I mean, it's a project that I knew was going to be something that I started and will finish either before, hopefully before I pass away. But I mean, it can take a lifetime, or if I get the right kind of enthusiasm behind it, that I might be able to finish it a lot sooner.
So the greatest point of optimism is that you're going to finish it.
Yes.
Right, okay.
Yes.
Yeah, please. Oh, sure.
Do you think you might run out of virtues before you run out of clays?
There is a possibility, but there is a possibility of using different languages, so calling them in other languages. So there is that possibility.
The Tower of Babel strategy. I like that. Okay. Alison, if I could come back to you now and ask you about the question of ornament. So this is something that clearly relates to Halima's work as well, but something that you've been fascinated by since you began your career, really, as far as I understand. Can you say a little bit about how you understand ornamental form in relation to your work? And I'm here distinguishing between ornament as something that could happen on an object as opposed to being a decorative art object as a matter of status.
Yeah, I have some ambivalence about it as a word. I think it was first something that came into my kind of vocabulary around my work with Peter Dormer, and he found it a very comfortable way of keeping the crafts a bit separate from art, I think.
Peter Dormer, the
Yeah.
great critic.
Yeah. I actually made a note about that because I find it quite confusing. I have often not talked about decorating things, but about painting them. And that may seem a bit pretentious and trying to be, something that I'm not, but it physically is painting the surface. And something I found very helpful early on was a piece of writing by George Woodman in the 1970s, a magazine article, where he talks about the relationship, very sort of intrinsic relationship between ceramics and painting, partly because a once-fired pot, in the case of earthenware, which is what I do, is a sort of naked thing. It needs something to happen to the surface, unless it's a flower pot, So there is that body and dress sort of notion, which I've always found really stimulating. So although I can't deny that decoration is sort of a great thread through aspects of life and art, it isn't always the word I want to use about what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Without wanting to sort of, try and magnify its significance, whatever. But for me, the exciting thing about making marks or painting areas of a three-dimensional thing, it's so different from working on a flat surface. And so the challenge for me is making the kind of marks that I make work with the form in a way that is not premeditated.
As a practical matter, do you find yourself making a three-dimensional object without a great deal of premeditation about what you're going to do in painting it?
Certainly, yes. And I also, early on, say at the time of the blue and white piece, a lot of that was on the sheet of clay before I cut it up. So that's then a dialogue between the 2D sort of image that you've made or arrangement of marks and how you cut it and therefore what you make, and then binding it together with another layer of painting, and then maybe a third layer of painting after the biscuit firing. So it's a gradual build-up of stages. Then, of course, with the red work, that's a all or nothing, one go at it before you fire it.
And if you're sort of making an arena for your own mark making, in essence.
Yeah.
And do you find that the relationship between gesture and pattern is a useful opposition when thinking about the
Yes,
role
I
of
do.
ornament?
Yes, I think that's good because in every case it's a physical movement and it's an arm, it's a flick or it's a squirt or whatever.
Yet there's also repetition.
Yes, yeah.
Because to me, there's a kind of tension between those two ideas, the gesture being in the moment and instinctive and immediate, and pattern being about planning and execution.
Yes. And then some of the gestures you make, you think, oh shit, why did I do that? Then you have to find some other strategy
Right.
of putting something over it or
Which is a real
extracting from it.
painter's problem,
Yes,
right? You made
yeah.
a mark you don't like, how do you make it better than the mark that you did want to make originally?
But I think in terms of sort of ornamental language, I think that that hybridity is a big word for me. I think the way things have overlapped things, like the way you see sort of Islamic Spanish culture in the capitals in Cordoba or whatever.
Yeah.
You see classicism and you see overlaid with an incredible kind of filigree thing, which I saw in Turkey and I saw it in Spain. And those kind of interrelationships of culture and history have been very inspiring, I think.
That's a good segue over to Halima, because a lot of your ornamental language, as I understand it, is actually drawn from architecture. So could you talk a little bit about your sources first for ornament?
Inspiration is drawn mainly from architecture and geometry found in nature. I think the pattern, for me, pattern is a universal language. It's my earlier work at university and was very figurative and very, I find with the ornamentation of the carving, the pattern found, people have looked at the work as individual pieces or within the installation, and it takes them to different cultures. So some people say it's very Moorish, some people say it was very Celtic or Neo-Gothic. There's lots of references, and for me what's really important is for my work that there's no era, so it could have been carved many centuries ago. It could be a piece like it is very present, and working with pattern, from when I started 20 odd years ago, there's always been that beautiful kind of feedback from people where the individual piece has taken them to, where they were travelling in Australia and they saw some Aboriginal art and and it took them back to there. So I think for me, pattern and the way I work with ornamentation is it varies a lot. In the sense, each piece is only ever carved once. I think through the whole duration of my career, I've probably only carved the same design twice when it's been a commission and it's been a project. So I've had to remake it when it's blown up in a kiln. So I mean, and with the installation, the kind of complexity of the design is all determined about how confident I am with the clay when I'm using it, when it's malleable.
Same question that I asked Alison. I'm curious about the actual process by which you get those extremely complex mathematical shapes into the clay. Are you working from drawings? Are you working from drawings on the surface of the object itself? How do you actually get that to happen?
I start off, I should say, with a good bottle of wine. No, no. I start off with making numerous sketches in my notebook. And especially with Virtues of Unity, there's different divisions in each of the pieces. Some have got 11, some have got 2, some have got 7. So I play with that in the design book. And it's only from choosing the design that I then use compasses and various measuring instruments. And then I map it onto the form, which is the vessel, a form that I've used right from the beginning of my career. And for me, the vessel is very exciting because when you've got a flat design and then you map it over something what's convex and concave, the design takes a new life, exciting new dimension. And then when you then further carve into it, you're then playing with the form even more. And what is a very static form has a lot of movement within the form and the way you've carved into it.
Okay. That's a really, I hadn't known that's how you did it. It's fascinating to think about you generating that process and inventing it as a way of getting your forms into the clay. And it's in fact the clay I wanted to ask you about next, so maybe we could stay with you for a minute longer, Halima. You are in fact making naked vessels by Alison's definition, so there's no glaze on, or even slip on the surfaces of your vessels, at least the ones we see upstairs. Can you say a little bit about the medium itself and what attracts you to it, as you said, as your primary artistic material, and your feelings about this material, clay, one of our most ancient of artistic materials?
I think it's a material that you can manipulate in so many different ways. I think the exhibition itself shows the various use and the possibilities are still endless with the work what's coming out from students today, and I think it's a material, no matter what level of creativity you have, you can definitely work with it. It's a very enjoyable, very malleable material. And for me, I did start with glazes when I was at university, but I soon discarded them just because there's so much going on with the carvings. And when you carve very sharp angles into the form and then you put a glaze on top of it, it rounds the edges, so it kind of defects the kind of shadows what are casted over the form, which create movement. It softens the shadows, so using the glazes is kind of something that I tried, and I kind of I dismissed them at an early age. But I mean, with the clay, I've worked with clay since school time, and from the very figurative work to the work that I'm doing now, which is all hand-carved, kind of very simple forms, but creating complex surface design within the form.
I really like the point you're making about clay as this vertical ladder that you can climb in terms of skill. Like, it's the first thing that you hand to a young child. You say, you might want to make some sculpture, here's some clay, and they make a little figurine or whatever. And the sort of simplicity of the means that you're using, actually, because it's not a complicated toolkit that you're using at all. Yeah. Alison, can I ask you the same question about clay? And I wanted to focus it in a particular way, which is to ask you about this most recent pot that we have in the show, Outpour. I was looking at it yesterday. I noticed how worked the surface is. So you can see the combing of that surface.
That's a broken hacksaw blade.
Broken hacksaw blade. I'm so glad I asked. But there's a lot of exposed clay in that piece. And I wonder what your feelings are, of course, about clay in general as a material, same question. But I also wanted to ask you about how you're thinking now about exposing that surface versus covering it up.
Well, I think I was exposing it because of the colour problem, the problem that it sort of dies when it's glazed, it seems to me. It gets too... just that beautiful... The mattness of the terracotta is its virtue, I think. But I think for me, it's the states of clay. The fact that you can intervene with the material at every stage and do different things. When it's really plastic and squishy, you can do certain things. When it's leather hard, you can paint slip on it, you can scratch through it. There's so many points of interaction that you can layer over each other. You can do 20 things to something, working all the way through to enamel painting on the line. That there's just it's such a sort of non-material in a way. It's a kind of mass. It's a sticky mass that has no real. It doesn't make strong demands. You have to find a sort of language with it that suits yourself. And just the openness of it, I think, is very special.
Is there a phase in that process from liquid to, useless solid, where you feel most comfortable? Like, is there a certain...
I think sort of beginning to be leather hard, where you can make a curve and it stands still, which you obviously have to make it when it's really soft and tie it up with strip of polythene, or, you know, so it doesn't fall over. So
Yeah.
that just so it's a waiting game. You know, you're doing things when it's really soft. You're setting up all sorts of funny kit, bandages, and leaning it against things and so on until it's at this joinable stage.
It almost makes me think that it might be possible to categorize potters in terms of when they do their most impactful creative work in the
at what
process
point?
in the
Yes.
studio, at
No, I
what
think
point in the
I think you might be
process.
able to, yeah.
Quite a lot of differences there
Yes.
among different potters.
Yeah, and I got into my 40s and was writing a piece that I got a friend who writes also to proofread, when it was pointed out that you really shouldn't use the word malleable about clay, because that's from metal. That's when you hit it with a hammer,
Yeah.
from mallet.
Oh, right.
So plastic is what you have to say, which takes you into another material altogether. But, you know, those kind of things are, I mean, the language of it, the sort of funny language that comes with knowing the material and the kind of history of the technology of it is another part.
It's more mutability
richness.
than
Yeah.
malleability.
Yeah.
One last question about clay. You, at least in my mind, you're quite significant in the history of British ceramics for your refusal of certain chestnuts of idealism that had been handed down to your generation. And of course, one of those chestnuts is that the clay represents the kind of earth from which we all come, and that there's a sort of eternal humanism that's intrinsic to the material. And I think of, at any rate, your generation as having really thrown a lot of that out and said, well, let's see what else we can think about here. How do you think back now to that kind of idealism? Is it something you have any sympathy with? Is it something you actually share yourself?
The sort of the soil aspect of it, do you mean?
Yeah.
No, I think the universality of it is really amazing. You know, that it is there is a culture of ceramics everywhere on the globe, pretty much, I think.
As Halim has demonstrated.
Yes, as you're
Yeah.
demonstrating. I think that's a very powerful idea. Yeah.
How about the vessel form? Is that something that you also respond to as a universal?
I moved away from the word vessel in the 80s. I think at the point when Garth Clark and co were talking about the VOCO, the vessel-oriented ceramic object, which just
That's
seemed
terrible.
a bit much. I like three-letter words very much. I like the word pot, the word jar. Container is fine. It's a longer word. But no, I could do without the word vessel, because it seems to me to be poeticizing something which may or may not be deserved.
I see. So it has a kind of elitism
And
built
it's
into it.
biblical as well.
Biblical,
Another
yeah.
problem.
Yeah, and maybe gendered in a problematic way as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So what about thinking about it as a pot or simply something that holds space? That's something that clearly you are very unswervingly interested in because it's
Yes,
something that
yes.
anchors a lot of your work, all your work really.
Yeah.
So what is it about that relationship between the wall, the
Container.
exterior and interior space that keeps you coming back?
Well, one of the things is everyone approaching a pot is not daunted. You know, they think, oh, that's a pot. I'm not frightened of that. Then there may be other things you notice about it, but it's a very easily communicable form. Beyond that, I think there are more sort of personal feelings I have about the comparison of an exterior and an interior. So there's that dialogue between a dark hollow and a sort of lit outside. Which,
like a model of psychology.
which it can be a building, it can be a body. You know, there's all these other little, you know, possible references within it, and I think it's a sort of it's an exciting form. I mean, I think I many years ago I wrote down in some diary or other a lump of clay with a hole in it makes an offer that a lump of clay does not.
Yeah. It also makes me think about, you know, when you walk around upstairs, of course, all these objects have been put out on display for your viewing pleasure, but of course, almost all of them, you can't see what's inside them, simply because of your viewing angle. So there's all this decorated, worked, considered space up there that's not visible to you, because you don't actually have that in the hands relationship to the pot. It was very different from the back of a painting, where
Sure.
that's
Yeah.
not meant
But
to be important.
if you live with the object, then you have all sorts of opportunities to move it, to walk around it, to kind of look inside.
You could take the potter up on that offer more fully, perhaps. Yeah.
Yeah.
Halima, what about your views on the vessel? It's again something that you've come back to again and again. What keeps you coming back?
Again, I relate it to architectural aspects, carving the inside with the outside, and thinking about the structure of the form. And so in various areas, there's only millimeters thickness compared to a few inches on other parts. And working with that challenge with the varying thicknesses of the form. And that kind of part what's intrigued me are the kind of neo-Gothic buildings, especially where I was brought up in Manchester, where the inside of the architecture and the outside of the architecture work together. So a lot of the things are there not just for decorative purposes, but for constructional purposes. So what's happening, so if I'm carving in one angle in the inside, then I have to, the outside design is considered to be carved on the opposite direction, so the structure of the form, which is very simple but very exciting for each one of the designs I've ever done. So.
In fact, it's maybe not so simple, because you imagine taking a cross-section through one of those pots, how incredibly complex it would be, and being able to maintain that in a symmetrical fashion around the pot. It's quite extraordinary, especially when you're doing these daredevil thinness, these points or junctures of thinness, yeah.
But all that's considered so that the construction of the pot doesn't collapse. I mean, I do carve into the piece. You were talking about different stages at which people work. And I work with the clay when it's way past leather hard, when it's almost dry, so I can carve into it with all the sharp angles. So there's not much room for mistakes. Yeah, towards the end,
Getting a dust off at Alison.
So I suppose when I started carving into stone, it was quite easy, because you're working with that kind of like hard material. So.
Yeah. It reminds me of a friend of mine who's a stone carver, and he says he really loves working limestone because there's no point polishing limestone. It turns dead when you do that. And so you have to have good chisel marks, because that's the only thing that's interesting in a limestone carving. And your work has this wonderfully worked quality for sure. Can I just finish by asking you both the same question I asked Tanya earlier, simply in respect of the talk that I'm about to have to give, which is about the future of studio pottery. Do you have views on that question? What do you think the future might hold? Halima.
It is really, I mean, I think, ceramics is getting the respect and the recognition it deserves in the European countries. Over the years, travelling, spending time in Japan, it was considered the highest form of art, and then spending a few months in Pakistan at the universities. It was interesting because the ceramics lecturers wanted me to be in their department, and the sculpture lecturers wanted me to be in their department. And in Pakistan, if you failed at everything, you got to do ceramics. So, and the clay was so difficult to work with. It was, I had to modify it and add things into it. So it was wonderful, that kind of different status the material had in those two different countries. But I definitely think, I think it's getting the respect it deserves.
More optimism from Halima Kassel. Thank you. Alison?
I'm mixed, because I think the demise of some of the sort of major ceramics departments in what were art colleges and then sadly got absorbed into universities is catastrophic. I mean, I think that's a body of knowledge. I think not just the British ones, but some of these Scandinavian courses that have also folded had incredible resources. Like, the most extensive glaze library anywhere was in Kolding, one of the factories in Denmark. Oh, not factories, schools. So every time something closes, and particularly they were good at relating to the industry as well. That was very significant for much longer than might be remembered. But so I think that's really concerning. At the same time, there seems to be a sort of upsurge of people you wouldn't expect to be wanting to do evening classes in ceramics. And apparently there's some very important sculptors are now throwing porridge bowls in their spare time.
Which could be a good thing.
Could be a good thing. I think there is a sort of underswell of all sorts of people now, learning a bit about throwing and now selling their work that's a bit in imitation of Lucy Ree on the internet and doing terribly well. And I don't know if that's good or bad, but it's certainly happening. I think there may always be a sort of counterculture aspect to ceramics that will pop up in some other ways. But I think the term, I think you want to talk about particularly, although it slipped around a bit today, the term British studio pottery. I mean, I wouldn't actually call myself a British studio potter. I think that term relates to the modernist establishment of that new mode
Yeah.
of being with Leach and so on. But I know what it means, but I think as a title for the whole show, I mean, a lot of the work upstairs wouldn't put itself exactly in that category.
Not comfortably, for sure.
No.
Yeah.
But we've also said ceramics, which is extremely flexible.
Do you think that the medium, if we just call it a discipline, perhaps, do you think it actually might be at its best in a countercultural mode? In other words, when it achieves a kind of hegemonic status, it becomes less effective somehow?
I think that sounds fantastic, but it does mean a lot of people are just going to be going the slow way to learning stuff that they could have learned quite quickly in a more formal setting.
Right, okay. So there's an element there of respecting the knowledge of the past and treating it seriously rather than reinventing the wheel, as it were, over and over again. Yeah. Okay, Halima and Alison, thank you very much. I think we might have a minute or two for questions, is that right? Yeah? So if there are questions from the floor, either from our glorious sunlit side, I'm reminded of what happens at a football match. We have our hardy souls over here who are being irradiated, and those of you in the shade. So any questions for our two artists?
Alison, you said you wouldn't call yourself a British studio potter. What would you call yourself?
I would say, well, my passport, it says artist. I often say ceramic artist, but in some contexts that seems a bit pathetic. I say potter. Yeah, those three, I think.
Other questions in the back?
Hi, this is a question for Halima. The conception of virtues of unity is, to me, feels an honor to be close to that. It's very elusive, it seems, that sort of weaving together of peoples. And I wonder, have there been any thoughts that have occupied your mind crossing mediums? So, for example, could you consider, I wouldn't know how it would happen, but some sort of show where your piece was center stage and someone curated oil on canvas to try to line up the virtues that you've identified for a particular country with other mediums, where there could be some sort of coterie of artists that, dead or alive, would end up being a sort of expansion of your conception that just strikes me as something that would be wonderful to see. Has anyone ever conceived that with you, or could that go anywhere? Does that have any interest to you?
It sounds like a wonderful idea. It's not something that's crossed my mind. I think the last few years is just all the energy's been into collecting the clays, but I do have great hopes and aspirations that the piece will travel around the world, and as it grows and as it but yes, it's a wonderful idea to have different cultural and different mediums with the installation. Yes, next year it's at Manchester Museum and Art Gallery. It's changed their name, sorry, Manchester City Art Gallery, and there it'll be displayed with other materials that I've worked with. So there'll be marble, there'll be stone, there'll be glass, there'll be concrete, and all of it will be hand carved. Well, actually, the glass and the bronze is cast. So there will be contacts with other materials that I work with over the last 25 years with the virtues of unity.
Thank you.
So I suppose.
So Halima doesn't require any other artists to contextualize her work. It does sound like a fantastic idea, though. Maybe one last question, if there is one? Yes. Or we have two, actually. Okay.
I wanted to ask Halima, when you're carving your bowl vessel shape, is there a clay that you particularly like to work with, rather than the clays from all over the world? Is there one that suits the carving well?
Yeah, the black German clay, that works really well. There's a white porcelain and stoneware mix from Valentine's, which I like. I don't like working with it, but I like the result, the finish of it. And then the basic clays like the crank and the terracotta crank, which again, you were talking about working with terracotta after such a long time. And I hadn't actually conceived a proper sculptural piece. And last year I did a commission for Manchester Museum where they had a few hundred-year-old terracotta piece next to the piece they commissioned from me, and it was the first time that brought me back into working with terracotta when they were displayed together, the kind of relationship with the old and the new. But again, I really enjoyed working with that, and those clays are very forgiving in the way I work, because obviously the forms, the last piece I carved had 80 kilos of clay in it. So you've got to have a clay what's going to allow it not to crack and explode. Yeah. So.
I think we did have one last question in the front here. Yes, this will be our last question. Just hold on for the mic if you don't mind. Thanks.
Thank you. Hiya. I wondered for both of you, the last question talking about the future of where ceramics might be going. Alison, I know already you teach or used to teach, and Halima, you mentioned going to some universities in Pakistan. I wondered what influence you think teaching might have had on your own work and the pathway through your own practice.
Do you want to start?
Yes.
Okay. I like communicating, and I think it's just one way in which you can communicate both, well, largely verbally, but also through visual means. I love how people change in the process of learning. I mean, I've taught at the RSA for 34 years and just stopped. My last day was last week. And I have some incredibly strong relationships through ex-students, this kind of diaspora body of fellow feeling, I think, in a way that's really rewarding. I think it has been an incredible body of institutions to be a part of, and the way that it's changing is uncomfortable and so on. That they kind of, but I have got 4 granddaughters now who I expect will involve, time in the studio.
I think it was said earlier on in the conversation, even though a lot of institutions are closing or minimising, I think there are a lot of artists who are opening up their work, their own studios, and teaching and doing masterclasses. I mean, I do that myself. I mean, I have gone into universities and colleges and worked in primary schools a lot in the past, and when you find your own work gets too busy, you don't have the time. But the teaching that I've done and will be doing with the masterclasses, you could have someone who's never touched clay, and then you could have someone who's a professional in the material. And for me, what's exciting is what's achieved out of the week-long or 10-day class, is really exciting, and it does. Normally the classes are run with the idea of the process that I work with. So, getting people to use both hands to carve with, and people who are definitely left-handed or right-handed, and getting them to use both of the hands like I do, to get the kind of curvilinear shapes from one side repeated on the opposite side, and the pleasure you get out of what people come with ideas and what they leave with, and their fulfillment. So you always get repeating students who want to come back to the classes and stuff. Does that answer it?
Okay, I'm thrilled to report that you're now allowed to have tea, maybe even coffee. But first you must join me in thanking my 2 co-panelists, Alison Britton, Halima Cassel.